These are two very different players. One is incredibly physical, while the other is beautifully elegant. But they both have to sprint. But should they both train sprinting in the same way? I started with an idea. All players sprint, but not all players sprint the same way. I collected high-speed running and sprint data over the course of a game and analyzed the general movement. We can see there are many kinds of sprints. Linear, curved, ones with cuts and different distances. Let's analyze how we can further segment this data to create specialized sprint training. When thinking about how we can segment this data, the obvious option is to do it by the position of the player, but I think we can also analyze it by the type of run, so we can enrich our data by looking at the event type. This, for example, is an off-the-ball run and the typical movement pattern during that. And this, of course, is going to be different than an on-the-ball engagement. Our four types of events are off-the-ball run, on-the-ball engagement, passing option, and player possession, where player possession is going to be the least common when it comes to high speeds. Traditional metrics show us aggregate information, which is useful in some ways. But in order to understand movement geometry, we need more advanced metrics. So I created some derived metrics so we can differentiate the kind of runs. Alright, so let's rewind for just a moment. In order to talk about how we got those metrics, we're going to have to talk about a data science topic called clustering. And clustering is an ontological term, which means that it does what it says it does. It clusters things. So we're going to take like objects and group them together, or cluster them. First, we translate movement into a measurable geometry: verticality, curvature, acceleration, and directness. Then we place every movement into a geometric space, and more on that in a moment. But movements that behave similarly naturally move closer together. Finally, clustering identifies the dense regions of the repeated structure, the movement families. And since we have so many dimensions, we're working in a multidimensional space. This is hard to conceptualize, but instead of 2 dimensions, let's look at 3 dimensions. And instead of drawing a circle, we're going to draw a sphere. We have 7 dimensions, and we cannot rationally think about what that would look like, but a computer can. I'll use a 2D graph going forward to help with my words, but the circles won't be precise because we're working with many more dimensions than I can show. Hey, so if you've made it this far in the video, consider giving me a subscribe and definitely leave a comment on something you would like to see in the future. We're going to focus on ball engagements for a moment. Our algorithm has identified 2 clusters for these types of high-speed runs. C0 will be more of our front line, the attackers, C2 our midfield, and C1 our defenders. And with our next graph, we can see the different variables that we created our clusters on. What this really shows is that there are differences in how each position sprints. Our midfield sprinted the longest distance per sprint, and our defenders the shortest. Our midfield were also the fastest and the most explosive. The forwards had more curved runs and variability. When training these different positions, you really want to understand the physical demands that each position has, and these require slightly different muscle groups, but definitely different training regimes. And when you're trying to create a competitive advantage, you want to dive into these little details and really get the most out of it that you can. Let's take a look at some game footage and see 2 different kinds of sprints from 2 different positions. The first is going to be from a center forward, Erling Haaland. Notice his sprint starts off with a high intensity cut that turns into a more traditional long distance curved sprint. Next, we're going to look at a run for an attacking midfielder, Marmoush. Notice how he makes a much more direct run. So what is the practical application here? The answer is that there's no one-size-fits-all, but this is more of a study in how you can look at game data and tailor your training regime. So what I'll do is take this specific player with this specific system and we're going to look at his typical runs during a game. And then I'll create some training exercises so we can see how you can model them to a specific player. I'm going to analyze a right midfielder. And the reason I've chosen this player is that their run starts off a bit chaotic. Then there are some short sprints with heavy directional changes. And then to end it, there is a bit of a longer sprint. Okay, so a good strategy in life is to break things down into their component parts and tackle one at a time. So that's how I would train this specific sprinting. Because the start of Haaland's run was a bit chaotic, I would incorporate some hurdles and maybe some cones just to give some running variability and to get some footwork in. Next, I'd want to incorporate some sharp cuts and turns at high speed. We can do that by doing shuttles or this cone drill. Finally, we're going to work on an all-out sprint at a distance that is appropriate for this player. An important concept to notice is that you work on each of these components separately. Then when you have them down, you can stack them on top of each other and do them consecutively. In order to round out this video, I want to talk about another important concept. This channel is mostly focused on data science, math, and how that relates to the sport of soccer. But I actually hold a degree in psychology. So I have a BA in psychology and a BS in computer science. And so I can't divorce myself from the reality that what we are doing is playing a human game. And I don't think you should. I think data always needs to be matched with industry knowledge, as well as when you're working with humans, taking care to that important aspect. The point of practice is to get better at something. And part of the reason for that is that the more often you do something, the more it becomes part of your muscle memory, and the easier it is to accomplish later on. The brain works in a very similar way, and in that sense, it's a bit of a muscle, is that the more often you practice with it, the easier the recall is later. And there's an important part of computer science called temporal locality, and this has to do with if a specific memory location is accessed recently, then it is highly likely that it'll be accessed again in the near future. And so when you practice a principle like a cone drill, it's something that teaches your body to translate into the game. One way to train the brain is to actually do the exercise in a location that matters. So what we have here are heat flows for a right midfielder per event, and these are the locations on the field that the right midfielder is most likely going to make a high-speed run or a sprint. So have your training blocks actually set up in these parts of the field can help train the brain at the same time. Alright, so we've reached the end of the video, and I love data science. I love these more complex and more advanced topics, and that's really what I want the channel to grow into. So if you like this one, once again, maybe think about giving me a subscribe or a like. Comment below on topics that you want to see me incorporate from data science into soccer. And until next time.